both done ourselves as Torontonians because we know that these spaces have value, but we've also learned from elsewhere that there is a value to having life on our streets and people out and creating. If you create spaces that people want to be, that will be great for our communities. It will be great for business. It will be and it will create places where people can thrive.
Thank you, Matti, for joining us. Welcome to Untitled Planning. We look forward to, chatting with you and learning more about you than I guess we already know, but like diving deeper.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Well, our first question for you is really I want to know a bit more of your origin story. Like, how did you get into planning? We see you all over TV. How did you get into this field?
I've always loved cities and how cities work, how people live in cities, how they're experienced in various ways. And I can remember that going way back for me personally. And I went to Toronto Metropolitan University for undergrad and did the applied geography program at the time. And it was an opportunity to really start to learn more about how cities function and the way that land use influences transportation, influences infrastructure investment, influences people's perceptions of their city and their experiences within them. So that geography foundation was really useful. And then I spent a year in Europe and going to school. And in Europe, got to travel a little bit and learn from just a really diverse group of people and diverse settings and just see cities differently. I grew up here in Toronto and felt I understood Toronto very well. But it was so eye-opening to go abroad and realize there are many different ways to arrange a city and many different ways that people live in cities. And then had the opportunity to go to UBC in Vancouver and see a very different part of Canada. That the ocean and the mountains were stunning and very different than my experience here in Toronto. And so really my origin on cities is just a love of their diversity and their difference, and both in terms of the way people live in cities and their built form, and trying to understand a whole lot more of it has been what's really kept me captivated and interested over now what's been a 15-year career studying and learning more about how cities function.
So just the overall function of the city, how people interact with cities and space, that kind of has always caught your eye.
Yeah, the connection between the physical and the human. That's what geography is, and that's also in many ways what planning is. That planning is about the future of space and the people who inhabit them, and how those two interact, how people, how space shapes human interaction, and then how human interaction in those spaces then shapes what is built and how it gets used and what is built in the future. And I think that really is something that continues to excite and interest me in all sorts of different ways. And cities are constantly evolving. And when you have that understanding of cities as kind of systems of systems, you take that mentality and you can take it to all sorts of different areas, whether it's transportation, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's physical buildings and the types of mixing of uses that happens in those buildings. You start to see them as the scholars Graham and Marvin, Simon Marvin and Steve Graham, they talk about the idea of congealed social interest. And I think that's such an evocative term. The word congealed interests me, and the word social interest interests me as well. This idea that cities are the building blocks of all of the people that have come before. And that's what planning is then. It's about who is involved in that building, what their interests were at the time, and then how the amalgamation of those different interests and the vast sweep of history gets us to what you see today, and ultimately then where we're going is what the role of planning is.
Yeah. And so you talked about you went to Europe, and I think there's something about the important. We talked about in other episodes about the importance of traveling to other places to learn some of like you said, going to UBC, seeing the mountains gave you another impression of what a city could be like and what city living could be like. But I guess in terms of your experience, in terms of cities that you've seen, what were some of your favorite highlights, or what was something that you learned from abroad that you'd wish to see more here?
In many ways, I would say UBC was as eye-opening as being abroad and living in Vancouver and seeing a different side of Canada. I mean, for me, as someone who was born and raised in Toronto and really got an urban awareness in this city, to then see that there was a different way of building a city, that Vancouver Vancouver has a different built form. It uses different materials. Toronto is a city that historically had been built of brick. Vancouver has it has some brick, but it's much more of a younger city. It has more concrete type of buildings, and then glass and steel as it moves into its big development boom in the 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s, and just a very different visual. And then also the use of wood in that city, and the way that transportation intersects with the water in various ways. I mean, Toronto, for the longest time, it's a city that's on one of the Great Lakes of the world, and yet for decades it didn't feel like you were in a city with a lake and with any access to water. And so to go to a place like Vancouver that has this deep connection with water and deep connection with nature running all the way through it, again, Toronto has that and has had it with the ravines and with the waterfront, but for a long time it didn't feel like those connections, at least in my life, were as deep as they could. And I think seeing that in a place like Vancouver, and then coming back and watching what's happened with the waterfront redevelopment, which I had the pleasure of being involved in a little bit, sitting on the board of Waterfront Toronto for a few years, and seeing what the process, again, the connection of the physical with the human, the processes of how you stitch a part of the city that had been sort of in our mental map, kind of forgotten, stitched back into the city. I think that was really eye-opening. And then you learn from places like Europe, or you learn from Asia as well, about the role of mixing of uses and the role that intensification and density that our cities here in Canada have tended to have dense cores, but have sprawled around their peripheries. In our growth period, we were built around the car, and you're starting to see people starting to come up with other ideas and ways of building our city, of intensification, of transit-oriented communities, and we're really in a struggle right now. As there is huge interest in intensification of our city here in Toronto and across the country, and at the same time we're sprawling around the edges. And so there's kind of like this duality happening all at the same time, which is I think really one of the questions of our time for cities in North America. It is really this question of how does intensification meld with the pressures that still exist around our peripheries, and that urge to go outwards as well as upwards.
So you've been to quite a few cities, right? And so you've described how the differences of physical cities look like, and we talked about the importance of water in the city in Vancouver, and how we've lacked that for a long time in Toronto, but that also shapes how we've interacted with space, right? And like how culture kind of comes out of that. Because I just visited Vancouver a few weeks ago, so it was very beautiful. The physical environment's very beautiful, but really I kind of understand people's kind of like obsession with how they interact with space, and like why they rep Vancouver so hard. It's not necessarily the city itself, but it's like how the city was implemented within the space itself, right?
One of my experiences in Vancouver was when I first got there. You'd kind of go to some of the main commercial areas, especially in the summer, and as a Torontonian and someone who had been to other cities, you'd kind of look around and be like, where is everyone? It's kind of a little bit quiet, a little bit sleepy for a city that's this big. And what you realized was that people weren't sitting around waiting to walk down the main avenues. They were on the beach, or they were out enjoying nature, or they were up at Whistler or Squamish, or really that people were using the city in a very different way. And and each city takes on its own culture and has its own experience. And I think Vancouver of late has become much more of a place that is more of a busy urban experience. And then you come to Toronto, again, to give another experience. I remember as a kid growing up here and it feeling fairly quiet. I mean, Toronto had a reputation of being Toronto the good, and for a long time you couldn't shop on Sundays, and it was a fairly kind of quiet, reserved type of place. And then you'd go to Montreal, and it would just be just excitement and enthusiasm and exuberance on the streets everywhere. I mean, like, to be young in Montreal in a summer has got to be one of the greatest life experiences one can have. And and to come back, and I think what's amazing is of late, there's been so much transferring of these ideas that these ideas can spread much more quickly. That that again, to take a city like Toronto, urban design, for example, has become something that we have embraced in a way that we never did before. We often felt that like function was good enough. And now we talk about like, can we not have nice things here? And we definitely can. I mean, you look at something like Love Park, which just opened, with really, with just that creates a physical space that people can interact in and want to spend time in. You look at some of the urban design on the waterfront, like Sugar Beach, for example. Again, something that these were forgotten spaces that no one thought would be inhabitable. Something like the Bentway or Underpass Park under the ugliest expressway, where maybe 10 years ago there was literally concrete falling off the side of it. It was in such poor maintenance, and it still requires constant vigilance. But you started to see how people are reinterpreting and reimagining and reusing those spaces. And I think that is something that we've both done ourselves as Torontonians, because we know that these spaces have value, but we've also learned from elsewhere that there is a value to having life on our streets and people out and creating. If you create spaces that people want to be, that will be great for our communities. It will be great for business. It will be and it will create places where people can thrive.
Yeah. So after living in all these cities, did you immediately start working at the University of Toronto? Do you did you just jump right into it, or was there a?
So I had an interlude after UBC. I spent 2 years or thereabouts at the University of Glasgow. So moved to Scotland, and again, this experience of living in a place that's very different. I mean, Glasgow is a big Scottish metropolis, and it is energetic, it is boisterous, it is bold. It was again just one of these experiences that tells you a lot. When you go and live in other places, it also tells you about the place you're from. And you start to see your own city through the lens of what those places do really well, and maybe also some of the things they don't do well. I mean, Glasgow had been post-industrial for a long time. It had struggled, and then it went through sort of a culture and arts-led regeneration. It had been big in shipbuilding, and had been a real hub for labor, unionized labor, and industry. And then it goes through this long decline. And what you learn is that like the people that were there love Glasgow and rep Glasgow, and and built it back up into something, and pulled it up because they weren't willing to give up on the place. And it's and they led with this culture-led approach where they did a big waterfront regeneration, and a whole host of other strategies. And again, you start to see your own city through those lenses. And none of these strategies have been perfect. I mean, they've been critiqued as driving gentrification and changing the fabric of the city. But and you learn about some of the trade-offs inherent in all of these policy decisions. And you also learn about a place that just has people there that are just deeply passionate about what it means to be Glaswegian. And again, you start to see your own city through that lens. And so when the job came up to come back to Toronto, I actually had time left on my contract, but it was time to come home. I mean, my family is here, so there was a personal connection, and there was also a connection back to the city and a place that I cared deeply about and really want to have an impact on.
I think that's an important part about planning. I feel like, I don't know, I feel like if you were to ask all the planners kind of how they got into planning, it's like at the core of it is that like love, where it's just like, I love where I live, or I hate where I live, but I know it could be better. Or I've lived somewhere else and I'm like, I kind of like what they do. How do I bring it here, kind of thing? Yeah, we've all been kind of inspired in that way to bring our own communities back to life.
I think that's such a fabulous point. And the way that those ideas transfer and translate is going faster, because of mass travel, and also because of the internet, and you can learn more about this stuff. And I think for each of us, we bring our own set of histories to planning. I mean, it's our own congealed social interest, right? It's, in my case, it's a family tie. It's a deep love and connection with Toronto itself, and again, what it means to be Torontonian, and what the values of this place are, and what it means to contribute in a place that you have deep roots, and but also a place that many people are coming to and then putting down their own roots in their own way. And I think that has been one of the other parts that I've really come to appreciate about Toronto, is how much growth and change has happened, and how it has been, how we've grappled with that and tried to address what happens when you are growing at this pace and also experiencing as much change and difference as we do. And I think Toronto has really, in many ways, we've both struggled with it and we've excelled. And I think that's, Toronto is a funny place. We depending on who we're talking to, we're both our biggest fans and our toughest critics. And I think in some ways that has enabled us to become better, because we are able to see, and we're able to look at this place and not see it as something that's perfect and freeze it in time, but rather enable others to come and tell their story through the place and have put their own stamp on it, and enable this place to become better. I think that's on our best days. Yeah. And I mean, obviously we're grappling with all sorts of issues now. We're grappling with housing affordability crisis, drug toxicity crisis, mental health. I mean, it's, and then not to mention crumbling infrastructure and congestion. I mean, the daily frustrations of living in a big city. So we grapple with it. But I think to me, that's what is exciting about being here. And again, as someone who grew up here, to be able to be part of, to be at the university training the next generation, and also to be engaged in the conversations is just something that excites me every day.
It's awesome. I think that's this talking about like living and having a lived experience in many different areas. And we've mentioned this on previous episodes. Like I've lived in many cities. Alex has lived and visited many cities. And that's like played a massive role for myself of just like planning how people interact with the space. And, like fortunate to have had a father who was in the architecture planning kind of world as well. And so that's kind of, you see something and he kind of explains it to you. He's like, this is made like this because of this reason. And you're just like, you're like, I was like, who? Yeah. But it's interesting because a big part of why we're doing this is I think it's really important for people to know why cities are shaped the way they are. And we all have lots of friends, and they kind of ask questions where for us, it becomes like the back of our hand. Like we think people should know why we have a waterfront, for example, or like why there's a housing crisis. The first thing someone asked me about housing crisis was, is it just is it because we lack material? And I'm like, well, there's like, there's that, but then there's like 10 other factors, right? Or like even more. So it's interesting. And like having different lived experiences, it kind of shows you how other communities operate, whether you're fully conscious or you're subconscious about it too.
I love that thought, because as you're talking, I'm picturing the conversations I have with my kids now, where we have those exact conversations where, we'll look around a city and we'll talk about, why is there a one-story building at the corner of Broadview and Danforth? Right. How many people are not living in our neighborhoods and in our communities because we've kind of frozen that area and made it hard either financially or from a policy and approvals process to intensify around there. And that's and we have constant conversations where they ask me stuff and I learn from some of their questions, and I ask them stuff from their perspective. And I think and to your comment about friends and broader networks, I get that too. I mean, in many cases, like you go to a barbecue or a party, and sometimes you get the questions that are so out of left field, and then they just make you think. You're just like, I hadn't thought of it that way. And I think in planning, sometimes we get so used to what the standard answer is, and it's so important for us to be out in the world talking to people who are not in this business or in this field, and maybe see things a little bit differently, to both understand what questions people are asking, but also see it from their lens. And that actually ladders up from the informal to the formal, because that raises the question of how we do planning and engage. Like, for example, communities had been telling us for many years that they were becoming increasingly concerned about transit-oriented gentrification. That when new transit lines were being built, they were worried that like the construction itself was posing a challenge on their neighborhoods, and then once the line was built, they were worried that the rents were going to go up and they were going to get pushed out. And these are the types of things where if you listen carefully, you can both bring a body of knowledge to that shares insight on what has happened elsewhere and what does the research show. And reciprocally, you can also learn from what people are seeing on the ground. And these are the types of things where planning, we're very future oriented, but we're often learning from the past. And that creates this tension where things are going to be built and infrastructure is going to happen or housing is going to get constructed, like before we're able to then catch up with our theory or with our practice. And I think that's where listening to people comes in and can become very important, because they can share with you what they're seeing, and you can then bring to bear the research that exists. Because what's happening here in Toronto or in Vancouver or in Europe, it's never the first time this has ever happened. Like these processes are happening in concert in many different places, and you can try to learn from other people's experiences, and you can either make suggestions that the research doesn't support what is being shown, or conversely, these are the ways we're going to mitigate and be very proactive. And in the case of transit-oriented gentrification, for example, the city of Toronto in recent years has really become aware and has doubled down on trying to put in place policy and practice to enable transit to get built, because it's so desperately needed, but not start that cycle. And these are things that people had been saying many years ago, and it's taken time for us to get to this point. And I think that's part of the process, like whether it's in our own families and our own networks, or whether it's more broadly in the way that we're actually making policy and engaging people in those in the discussions about how our community is changing.
Amazing. So where are you right now as a professional, but as a professor? What's your current projects? Where's your energy being funneled?
Yeah, I feel like I have my dream job. I'm at the university. I mean, how privileged and lucky is that? I'm at the university. I get to teach students, which I think keeps you engaged with new ideas and shaping ideas of how the next generation is going to carry out city building and putting their stamp on our cities and understanding what they're seeing. So I do it at a personal level with my family, but it's more broad with the next generation of students, so that they can understand how to think through, not telling them what the answers are, but thinking through the challenges that we face and grapple with them in their own ways. And the Infrastructure Institute. The Infrastructure Institute was launched 2 years ago. I'm the director, and we look to engage in the maelstrom of policy practice. We aim to bring to bear what a university is excellent at, which is training and knowledge, and translate that into action. And it's such an exciting space, and we've been able to build a team that is remarkably diverse in terms of their expertise and in terms of how they go about it. And what we do is we do a lot of training and capacity building. We are big proponents of giving people the tools and techniques that enable them to engage and make cities more equitable and just. And to me, that's a really important foundation, and providing people with those skills and abilities. So we do work around social purpose real estate. We've talked about already in the last few minutes about the housing crisis and affordability issues. We've worked very hard to work with nonprofits who I think can play one of the key roles in providing different types of housing. We work with nonprofits to provide them with the capacity to carry out their own real estate projects and realize their own dreams and ambitions in a way that turns them from concept to reality. We do advisory work. We work directly with different organizations to provide support and with their ideas of city building. And then I do engagement, and I love being out in the world and talking about cities and talking about planning and trying to, again, do what a university is best at, which is learning from experiencing, bringing knowledge to bear, and trying to translate that into information that people can then draw on and ultimately into action. I think it's that sequence of action that I think is so important, that we really see the university and see our role as both training students who are going to be involved in action and creating initiatives and procedures that allow the university to support those who are doing work in the service of building more equitable, sustainable, and just cities.
Yeah, I guess for context, I mean, I work there.
Yes.
I work with Matti.
Yes.
And Matti was our professor, which is how we all kind of came together,
Yeah.
I guess, in this space at the university. But ultimately, I think that's what you just touched on was about that action piece, or that like bridge between, in other words, like bridge between theory and practice. It's always kind of like the I guess the phrase that we hear a lot about, at least in this university, or at least when we're talking about planning. But I think that's what's really exciting about, I guess, the institute's work, but like just in general about planning, is that like how do you take an idea, a seed, and I think that's all planning is really, is a community with an idea, with a seed. That like, oh, I want to see a skate park. How do you create a skate park? And then you just kind of go through all the ups and downs of doing that. But it's, I feel like what's interesting about this work, or the work that you're doing, is that showing people that there are pathways to make it happen. Because sometimes people have ideas and they just kind of like sit in a closet, or they sit in a drawer of your mind. But then how do you bring them to reality, and then in public space, or in live space, and then how that shapes the future of how people are living is really fascinating.
Cities are so complex that it can sometimes feel disempowering. It can
Yeah.
feel like maybe that's someone else's job. Like,
Yeah.
I have ideas, I want to get something done, but by the time I raise the capital, or I get the approvals, or like test the idea, the thrill is gone. This is just it's become too much. I'm just going to go back to my day job. And I think what excites me is you see this generation of people coming through now who want to make change in their communities,
Yeah.
and they want to be involved. So I think we've moved away from the idea of like the heroic planner who's going to, by force of will and their own charisma,
Yeah.
is going to do this on their own. And we've started to realize that the way that planning and positive change happens is through collaboration and meaningful relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes that can sound hokey and a bit naive, but actually there are so many levers to pull that no one organization can do it on their own. And we've seen it actually in our own city when organizations have tried to kind of gut it out and just force of will things through, they don't work. This community in particular here in Toronto, but I would say globally too, people like to be part of the process, and they like to be engaged in decision making, and that's where I think collaboration between organizations and involving people in decisions can be important. Now we need action, and it's the action part. I mean, the talking around in circles in perpetuity is also not going to work. The problems that we're facing are so steep and so severe that we, and so significant that we do need that action at the end of it. But we need to be coming up with ways to drive collaboration quicker. There's a body of scholarship that looks at this idea of what's called the collaborative advantage. It's this idea of achieving better outcomes than anyone could on their own. And I think that's how at the Institute, that we're really fortunate that you're involved in, that we've come to think about city building.
I think, with that being said, and with all your experience, what would, now obviously we can't just go like, this is the advice or this is the guidelines for everything, but a question we do like asking our guests, especially who have done a lot of research, it's what's kind of advice for planners, but people who are just involved in, or interested in getting involved with their cities. Because that's the thing we see is like there's a lack of involvement. Even though once I tell someone I work in city planning, they're like, oh, they have all these questions, or like what's funny, one of my friends, he's quite younger, and he goes like, oh, why don't we just build up? I'm like, you're so right. I'm like, you're so right, man. Why don't we build up? But he's like, people do want to be involved, but there's definitely a barrier, right, of entrance, of just like discussion or coming to these like counselor meetings and whatnot. Whether it's like too boring, or it's like doesn't work within the day because people work 9 to 5 and they have kids and they have all these other responsibilities, right? And so it's, so
to me, people want to be involved in things that impact on them personally, or impact on the big picture of how they see themselves and their children and their grandchildren living. And I think we need to find ways of engaging people where they're at, and having informed conversations and dialogues about what the likely impact is going to be of some of our policy decisions. And we're facing huge challenges. Like climate change, we're facing affordability crisis, we're facing mental health, addiction challenges, crumbling infrastructure, how we're going to pay for all of this stuff. And yet we're also facing a democratic deficit. I mean, declining numbers of people, or share of people voting. It's really, so we need to find new spaces and ways to engage people. And I think planning provides a dialogue. I mean, it's funny, not everyone is a transportation expert, but everyone goes out the door and goes somewhere.
Yeah.
Even if they're working from home, they still go to the coffee shop or they go to the grocery store. And, people, sometimes that's the level that people want to start the dialogue at. Yeah. And we need to find ways as planners in different mediums to meet people where they are, and to make these discussions issues that feel pertinent and relevant to them, and not always feel like we're talking to those who have planners speak. I mean, sometimes we speak in too many acronyms. That's a challenge. Sometimes we speak as if everyone agrees, like intensification. Yeah. I mean, the planning consensus now is around intensification, and yet many people still feel like they want to go outwards, or they don't want a laneway house or a secondary suite in their backyard. And so, we've started to see, that's one of those ones where we've started to see the conversation shift because of the policy urgency. And I think planners and planning really needs to be out there talking about why this is important and what we've learned from other places and what the likely impacts are and what the research shows. We should be leading with the evidence base that the university is really excellent at creating, and then be out in those spaces trying to share as much of this information as possible. And there's all these new spaces. I mean, podcasting is not so new, but it's one. Whether it's engaging on social media, whether it's being in the mainstream media, whether it's being at your local, being out in your community and attending community events. There's all sorts of ways to start engaging and communicating, and I think that's really how we're going to start to see the changes that our communities so desperately need.
So in this kind of phase, in this segment in our co-hosting episode, Matti is going to talk about housing and maybe sprinkle in some of his other interests, and we'll have this dialogue and this conversation. So first thing first, what interests you in housing overall? I know we're gonna. What's your?
I am so interested in the connection between housing and infrastructure. The idea that the way that we build our infrastructure influences what housing typologies and what types of housing get built, and what types of housing then influence what types of infrastructure are effective and how we fund them and finance them. So, and ultimately, that sounds kind of like that it's about concrete and steel and buildings, but it's really also about the types of communities we're building. It's increasingly about how we're building communities that have the types of spontaneous interactions, the types of that can support the types of businesses that are local, and the types of streetscapes that are really vibrant and lively, the types of places that encourage people and enable people to be active and move around in ways that they can either use a car less or not at all, or if we're building the types of spaces that are that really are locking in a very prescribed type of lifestyle, which is very much around the car, and can ultimately become expensive to provide, expensive to maintain, and expensive to live in.
And we've kind of been like circling around it in like different parts of the conversation, but a lot of the work that you do, and I guess that I do at the Institute as well, is talking about creative mixed use. Yeah. And so if you could explain a bit more about that, and like kind of how you kind of fell onto this, or not fall, but like what drove you to this topic, and then how that intersects with housing, and because that's a topic that comes quite across quite a bit. Yeah.
So much of my own practice, and I would say many people's practice in planning, is personal. I went to North Toronto Collegiate High School, and North Toronto was an aging building that essentially was at the top of the TDSB's list of schools that were going to be either needed to be maintained or were going to be condemned and sold off in its entirety. And in the years after I left, there was a big debate about what to do with it. And ultimately, the way that the school got saved was they rebuilt the school as a 3 or 4 story podium building with 2 condo towers on either side of it, essentially directly up above. And it got me thinking, like, can you really have a school with like built into the side of a condo tower? And then next once you see these things once, it's like if you see a red car once, or you buy a red car and then you start seeing red cars everywhere. It's like, then I start seeing this pattern of development everywhere. So then the TIFF Bell light box goes up. So again, the TIFF is the major film festival it's Toronto's major film festival, and it's one of North America and the world's biggest, most significant film festivals. And it essentially didn't have its own home base, and it was being run out of many different venues across the city. And ultimately, and the organization had no land of its own. And in order to be able to get this building built, that would become their home base, that would ultimately become the TIFF Bell Lightbox, what they did was they partnered with a host of philanthropists, and then ultimately a developer, and built a building that had a 7-story podium with a 50-story condo up above. Wow. And again, you might ask, like, would someone really want to live directly on top of a film festival theater that has tens of thousands of people in front of there for 2 weeks a year? And it turns out the answer was yes. People want to be where the action is and where celebrities are, and where the red carpet is. And again, you start to see this once or twice, and you start to see it everywhere. And Toronto actually has an even longer history of mixing schools together with, in this case, co-op housing in St. Lawrence Market, and with schools in other parts of the city. And then you started seeing these really creative, interesting examples come about. So in the East End, we have the Red Door Shelter, which is a shelter for women and families that's built into the side of an upscale condominium. Again, you might ask, how does this happen? What are the processes and what are the decision making? And does this work? And what's interesting is that's just one example. You start to see theaters, you start mixed with housing, you start to see recreation centers mixed with student housing, all of these types of synergistic uses that are using space in a way that allows the city to grow and thrive and change, and for development to happen so people have places to live, but also creates this social infrastructure fabric that makes for a thriving society. Because that's what we've really grappled with. We've grappled with this challenge of, if we build everything in its own single use, in its own footprint, things become so spread out that it's hard for them to be serviced by infrastructure. It's expensive for each of these facilities to be operated. And then it's difficult for people to reach them with anything other than the automobile. And you start to see a city like Toronto, none of this was intentional. All of this is this idea of the creative mixed use. And we call it creative mixed use for 2 reasons. One, the mixing is creative in the sense that there's no formula here. We have a full range of mixes that are happening, and some of them are really unusual and uses that you might not initially think are possible. So we have, for example, fire stations in Canada that are built and operating that have housing up above, and in many cases affordable housing. And your initial reaction for many people is, isn't that going to be loud? And it turns out there's been housing beside fire stations for many years, and you can come up with both noise mitigation strategies as well as programmatic strategies to make sure that you manage things like noise. And those buildings are operational in our cities. And so one is the types of uses that fit together. The second one is that there's no formula for how this gets done. Like, it's creative in the sense that it requires a degree of entrepreneurship. It's not like there's, fill out application A down at this window on this day and you'll be building this building. It's like, these are relationship based, and they're creative in the way that the confluence comes together. And what has always happened, I started doing studies on this like 10 years ago, and was finding that from a planning and a building perspective, they were working, and yet from a policy perspective, they were essentially an afterthought or a last resort. Like, people were coming to these not because they thought they wanted to build housing above a fire station or something of that nature, but because each party had no choice if they wanted to get their building built. And what our work has showed is, because we've now learned through research that this is an effective way of building, the question is, can you shift this from a last resort to a first best intentional strategy that would make them even better, that we can highlight the types of housing, we can bring forward affordable housing or types of cooperative or land trust housing, and enable us to get over some of the reticence and opposition to development by bringing forward the types of social infrastructure that creates community. often in the base or in the podium of the building. And you're seeing this. Toronto is a city that's flown completely under the radar. There are like 50 or 60 of these buildings now that are operational and working. And to me, it helps solve some of that conundrum around, how do we leverage development for the social and community interest.
And it provides more density, right?
Places for people to live.
Yeah.
I mean,
Housing density.
to come back to this, I mean, we're desperate for places for people to live. Housing has become immensely unaffordable. It's impacting young people in particular, but also people who have been renting or in precarious income situations, and now people with really solid jobs graduating from programs like ours are struggling, to find affordable places to live. I mean, this is really at a crisis point, and
Correct.
yeah,
Correct.
And the risk is big. I think we should be really clear about what the risk is. The risk is that that people who graduated from our excellent universities in this city and other big cities that are facing similar challenges. This isn't just a Toronto problem. They will look for other places to go, and in a city like Toronto, in a country like Canada, we might find that immigrants who have been wanting to come to Canada might find that either it's too unaffordable or they might not be able to stay. And that's also a risk for a country that has benefited hugely from immigration over the years. So, we have these challenges that the way that we do city building, really, like, this is such a critical moment. And what's interesting is that we're facing it here in Toronto in perhaps our own unique way, but we're not alone in facing this. I mean, many big cities with different dynamics. That's what's so interesting too. Cities under different political stripes, under different geographic dynamics. Like when I was in Vancouver, housing prices were skyrocketing, and people often talked about challenges with land supply. That Vancouver is landlocked on three sides. It has the ocean, the mountains, and the American border. So it's landlocked in a way that a city like Toronto is not, and many of our other cities across the country are not. And yet we're facing fairly similar types of challenges around affordability, and they're facing these challenges in New Zealand, they're facing them in Australia, they're facing them in the UK. It will become the challenge of our time. And to be super clear about this, there's not a shortage of land. There is not a shortage of land within our built-up areas. The gap is how we actually bring that land into the development process and build the diverse suite of housing that will provide housing with the size of units that people need, especially family-sized units, and also at the range of affordability and in some cases support services, whether it's for seniors support services, whether it's for people who need other types of supportive housing. That's really where we're at, but it's so urgent.
So, as you said, there's not a shortage of land. Let's have the discussion around the Greenbelt. As we know, they're cracking into the Greenbelt for housing, as they claim. What are your thoughts on that, I guess, as an experienced planner, professor?
I think opening up the Greenbelt and arguments around more land the need for more land are being used as a pretense for what are essentially business transactions, and to create more, to create opportunities for developers to develop. I mean, I think that's the province's own housing affordability task force said there was no need for land in the Greenbelt, and the regional planners have also said there's no need for that land in order to meet our housing targets. We should be very clear. We have a housing crisis. We need to build more housing units. We need to make sure that renters in particular are being provided protections. This is a challenge of housing supply. There's also issues on the demand side that we need to be aware of and plan for and put policy in place for. But what is not needed is opening up the Greenbelt under the pretense of a housing crisis that will really set us back in so many other ways. Keep in mind too, this isn't just about opening the Greenbelt. This is also about building massive highways that are going to traverse through the Greenbelt. These are the types of lands that in some cases are on floodplains. This is, the floods that we've seen in certain areas. These are the types of lands that flood. These are the types of areas that are ecologically sensitive. They're the types of areas that are for habitats and species. This is some of the best farmland in the entire country. Building on the Greenbelt is really the notion that we have a land shortage is being used, I think, as a pretense to open up areas that otherwise politically were infeasible. And I think that's what you're starting to see in some of the discourse, but you're also seeing huge swaths of the community pushing back and saying that this Greenbelt is critically important spaces. So this is where we're starting to see the political side of planning, and where sort of a policy debate has now turned into a political scandal over who's benefiting from these types of decisions, and we're kind of right in the thick of that as we speak.
Yeah,
it's like, it's beyond unfortunate because of all the studies and like professional experience out there, and the professionals out there that are going like, don't do it, like don't do it, please. Mm-hmm. And people, and like it still like seems like it's gonna happen, right? And it kind of just shows like, even though the evidence is right in your face that it's not needed, mm-hmm. like these things are like, they can still proceed forward, they can still happen, and and that kind of, it's like just a very unfortunate case.
So can just to give your audience a sense of the land, because sometimes we say there's no shortage of land, and then people say, well, where is that land? So let's just articulate like exactly where some of these sites are in our own region. So this is great. This is Toronto based, but you could find the same examples all across North America and likely all over the world. Mm-hmm. So one of the trends that's happening is some of the aging shopping malls mm-hmm. in our region and across the country and internationally, which were built as single-use shopping malls with very large parking lots, are mm-hmm. now being intensified. Mm-hmm. We did a study at the Infrastructure Institute that showed that just 6 landholders, mostly retail, like grocery stores, but a couple of other big box retailers, on their lands in this region alone, they could build 70,000 housing units.
Wow. This
is land that's close to, many of the sites are close to transit, they're close to servicing, there's no, you're not needing to run new pipes and new electricity cables, they're in areas they're already serviced. 70,000 units. This includes 3-bedroom units. This includes retail on the main floor, so you're building complete communities, and park space too. So you're not just building forests of high-rise towers. So that's one example. Just those alone, 70,000. We didn't even look at the shopping malls, of which many are now starting to be redeveloped. Some of the larger sites in our region, like the Portlands, like East Harbor, there's opportunities to build thousands of housing units in those types of areas. Then there's the publicly owned lands, and we've often been reticent, and different departments and agencies and boards have been reticent to intensify on their own lands. But there are hundreds of parking lots that the city owns, some of them in super prime areas that could be intensified. There's transit stations. We should be building up above those transit stations. If you were to travel along Eglinton and look at the new Eglinton Crosstown, we essentially built stations as glass boxes right on top of some of the best transit, not just in this city, but in this entire country. We built 2-story boxes, glass boxes, when we could be building housing for places for people to live, connected to amazing accessibility. There are opportunities, and these are just a short list. Recreation centers often have very large parking lots that we could be building housing on. Libraries can have housing up above. We could be meeting our housing goals within our existing built-up area, and sparing and not touching our what is our precious lands in the Greenbelt.
Yeah, and this is in the context of Toronto and the GTA.
Yeah.
Like, I'm from London, Ontario, where it's like sprawl city, like everything's sprawled, and they keep on pushing the boundaries, and it's like we have very little density. And there's this plaza, like the strip mall in London, and the developer that owns this whole strip mall, he was like, I want to essentially densify. I want to have a condo. I want to have cafe shops. I kind of make it a bit like a little Toronto village.
Yeah.
In London, we don't have that. And the council was like, no, it's going to create too much congestion. And I'm like, this is the most insane. Like I don't know, like as a planner I was like, that really like caught me off guard, that the reason or their reasoning was like congestion, or like we don't want traffic there.
So
And-
one of the things that's often eye-opening for people
Yeah.
is how long and how taxing it is to get approvals for intensification projects.
Yeah.
If they have to go through the committee of adjustments, it is a real tough slog.
Yeah.
We did some work where we looked at a project in the east end of Toronto. It was an affordable co-op building in the east end. It was being done by a nonprofit. They went through back and forth with the city about getting their approvals over a time period where interest rates went from something like 1.5% to something over 4%, and construction costs skyrocketed. This was a multi-year process. By the end of it, the financial feasibility of this relatively small building that was going to be affordable housing hung in the balance.
Yeah.
That whether this could actually meet its its financial feasibility targets was really in jeopardy. So time is money, and the approvals process is long. A number of studies you need to build intensification projects. In the list of places where we could be building, I didn't mention any of the infill types of missing middle housing along our avenues, and also some of the sort of what's often been called missing little. So things like laneway houses or garden suites or multiplexes, which again, much of our cities have been frozen in time by the way we've done zoning. In a city like Toronto, I think the number is something like 70% of the city is zoned in such a way that until very recently you couldn't intensify. So those are other areas. And what you tend to find is because of the cost of those units, you tend to see more of a slow rollout of those rather than a huge deluge. But apparently more are now coming forward, and the ability to build them without having to go through a committee of adjustments and sort of as of right, as long as you're meeting certain goals and they fit within the safety standards and setbacks and other types of dynamics that are at play, really then I think opens the door to that type of intensification. But we're also going to need these large projects happening like the plazas and others if we're going to and bigger projects at the shopping mall nodes. And again, one other point, I mean, we're building transit at a scale that has not been built in generations, and that is exciting, and it also means that we have an opportunity here to be matching transportation and land use. We talked about that earlier, and the risk is that we miss this moment. We build the proverbial glass box like we built along Eglinton, and miss that opportunity to pair all of that financial investment that we're building into the transit. We miss the opportunity to then pair it with housing, and in particular affordable options and large enough units for families and really places for people to live.
I think it's funny because I feel like in geography we talk about a lot about like brain drain, especially when you're talking about like what you call like the global south, and how there's no opportunities or there's a lack of opportunities or resources or just safety, and people go to other countries, and all these talented folks are living in these other countries. But I think some of the things you're talking about is sort of like a interregional like brain drain as well, if you think about it, where like all these talented youth, like all us university students who can't afford to live in this city that we love so much and learn so much about, we can't live here, so we're gonna have to go to I wouldn't even say like the rural areas, because even they're going to start becoming more expensive as we if all these they have been becoming more expensive, and as we go, if development continues the way it is, and all the plans that have been that are leaning towards sprawl continue the way they are, it will only get worse. But yeah, our cities, like you said, building these like glass boxes, the question is like for whom? Cities are ultimately about people. So yeah.
And and you're exactly right. And what a risk and what a potential loss if people can't either afford or find the types of places that they really that suit their families at a specific stage of life.
Yeah.
So I think that's a big issue. And then a lot of this stuff comes down to planning policy, and it also comes down to money. Like, how do you make the economics of these projects work? whether a project is being, even if the government is going to build these projects, there is still a financial imperative on the project. The governments themselves can only borrow for so long without revenue streams to pay that borrowing back. And so those projects also have to financially work. And keep in mind too, with both infrastructure and housing, there's also huge long-term operation and maintenance costs.
Sure.
And we've learned in our cities what happens when you skimp on operation and maintenance. On infrastructure, you end up with real safety issues. And on housing, you end up with real safety issues. I mean, we've recently had an experience where a TCH building had a collapse, which was stunning and tragic and heartbreaking. We had a moment a while ago where units were being taken out of TCH because the maintenance was so bad that they were not considered livable anymore. I mean, this is really both challenging for a city and heartbreaking for the individuals. So housing, there's housing and infrastructure. It's the upfront costs we often get hung up on. It's how many billions is it to build this thing? And then once the ribbon is cut, everyone kind of job done, great, on to the next thing. And yet the infrastructure needs to be maintained every day, every week, every month, every year for decades. And that requires revenue and capital and interest and attention. And that's I think, I often think of housing and infrastructure in this way as this sort of life cycle of an asset. And I think we really need to be thinking of the infrastructure in that way, because it gives you an insight into what sort of strategies need to be in place, and then also how much money is going to need to be there over the long term. It's not just the upfront capital, which itself is a staggering big enough number. It's also making sure that you have money to keep this going and in a state of good repair for its entire lifespan.
Yeah.
All right. Maybe we'll go to the review portion, media review, or
Yeah. So really quickly. Yeah, well, just really quickly. So there's this article that came out in the CBC, and I'll read you the title and you can take a look. But it says every developer has opted to pay Montreal instead of building affordable housing under this new bylaw. And so you can take a look at it briefly if you'd like. But yeah, just your thoughts on that in terms of what does that mean? Especially you were talking before about the finances and understanding that when you're building affordable housing, there's still costs the capital costs that need to be addressed and trying to make it happen. So yeah.
To me, it speaks to the need for funding from all orders of government and an all hands on deck approach to addressing our housing crises. I've done studies in the past on something called land value capture. The idea that as land gets intensified, it creates additional value, and some of that value can be captured and reinvested in things that are in the public interest, whether it's social infrastructure or affordable housing. And I think what this example shows is that you need a lot of density and a lot of development in order to raise enough money to build infrastructure or housing projects at the scale and cost that they cost now. And it just reinforces to me that some of these programs will struggle without the other funding mechanisms that are going to need to be in place if developers are going to pick them up and if they're going to really achieve our goals. I mean, I think we should recognize the financial dynamics of these projects and understand how challenging we are in an environment of higher interest rates and an environment of elevated building costs too. That it's that making the numbers on these projects work is hard, and that developers that we need to be looking at how we raise money from developers and also what other types of public resources can be brought to bear in order to make these projects a reality.
You want?
Okay, yeah. And then this other one is this other article is talking again about Montreal, and you talked about briefly about what it was like. Well, I can't re-say what you said, but basically about the idea of living in Montreal would be great. And yeah, someone who's used to live there, visited there, we can agree that we enjoy the city. Yeah. But this one article that came out is saying that car-free streets in downtown Montreal took political guts. And I think that's part of the magic of that city in particular. But anyway, the other part of the headline says, can Toronto do the same? And so what are your thoughts on that?
Can Toronto do the same? ? I mean, isn't that the story of our city?
Yeah.
Cities have different sort of political cultures and social cultures around change. And you know, Toronto, that's a perfect example of what has been and done in other cities. And we saw this during the pandemic too, that the pandemic, when the pandemic hit, other cities were very quick to bring in bicycle lanes or close off streets, and Toronto kind of hummed and hawed about it. We tend to like to look to others and see how things work and kind of dip our toe in. You know, the Toronto way is the pilot study. I would say often to the point where, like, even after the pilot has been proven to be successful, we kind of starve it of all the things that it would need to be successful. And here I'm thinking of the King Street Transit way, which from a transit investment was hugely successful in terms of raising ridership and even creating a somewhat inviting street. And then we just left all of the infrastructure to decay to the point where, you know, now it's not enforced. You just see it's essentially functioning like any other street, although we still call it the King Street Transit Way. So could Toronto do something like that? It's possible. I think we tend to be at our best when we learn from others, but we adapt those ideas to the way that work with our city, the way things function here, our political culture, our social culture, how we implement things. You know, we can learn from others and hopefully that gives us the courage to go. And then each of these policies needs to be adapted to its own context here. Some of them have been hugely successful and some of them perhaps less so. But I think the underlying principle of that story is that people love to be in places where other people are. That is the lesson that we're learning. And I think what's so important too, we should just say this as well. When I say the word Toronto, I think for many of us, the imagery that comes to mind is the gleaming towers of downtown, or maybe the waterfront, or maybe you know, one of the great avenues of our city. And we don't necessarily factor in that 2/3 of the people that live in this region, according to research by David Gordon at Queen's, live in something that's closer to approximating a suburb. So the actual image of Toronto should be either a suburban arterial road with a strip mall on it and many small shops, or a much more sort of outer suburban type of imagery. And to me, that's really where the future of this region is going to be told. It's do those areas remain frozen in their current shape and form? How do they adapt with intensification? Can transit work and function in an area that was never built for public transit? Can the services be brought close enough to people? And can we afford to keep the infrastructure that this would require in a state? Can we build it and keep it in a state of good repair? I think for many of us, that's so important to understand the geography of Toronto. Toronto is now a huge place, much of it deeply suburban, and we have to build to the types of geographies that we have. When it comes to streets, I mean, there are programs that now are like organizations like Plaza Pops and Parks People who are doing all these sort of like pop-up infill type of pilot programs to kind of proof of concept and show that if you create spaces that are vibrant, people will want to be there and they'll thrive and they'll be successful. But we have to learn this in our own context, in our own time, and then understand what the lessons learned are and how you scale it effectively.
Okay, and one really, really quick one. And this one is titled Toronto the Grey. The city's green space is disappearing and it's likely to get worse.
I mean, that one, we've seen this in all sorts of different ways. We've seen, in many cases, our ravines having challenges with the viability of some of the plants in our ravines. We've seen also huge inequalities in green space, and I think that's been one of the takeaways. One of the great things about Toronto and the academic institutions and the nonprofits here is there is a focus on understanding these dynamics of equity and who's getting included and who's being left behind, and telling those stories in a really compelling and important way, and then taking the next step of action to try to remedy them. And in Toronto, there's been a lot of focus on the unequal access to green space. So it's not just that Toronto is turning gray as a general statement, it's also that certain parts of our cities, especially low-income or racialized parts of our city. They started out gray, and they're
Yeah.
probably getting even grayer. And I think, again, these are the types of things that there are researchers and community organizations and local activists and local communities who are just are bringing these stories and making sure that they're told very clearly. Toronto has such a rich fabric of community-based organizations who advocate for themselves and partner with others to make sure that their voices are heard. And I think we're in a moment where I think there are policy strategies and there are community-based strategies that can try to address this issue of all the various types of inequalities that we're facing in our city. Inequalities around housing access, inequalities of income, and inequalities of access to green space and safe, affordable public transit and active transportation. All of these, I think there are communities that are really vocalizing this and making those stories told, and that we start with these narratives around Toronto, the gray, and then we try to do better.
I think that's it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Matti,
Of course.
for your time and all your insights and knowledge. It was great
Yeah.
learning from you and about you too,
Yeah.
as well. Yeah.
Where can people find you?
We'll learn more about your work.
Learn about your work,
Uh,
consult.
yeah, I'm easily found at the Infrastructure Institute. If you Google Infrastructure Institute, you'll find us. Please come to our website, take a look around. Feel free to reach out to me by email.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for watching. Like, subscribe, follow Instagram, and we're good.
Yes.
All right. Thank you so much, Manny.
Thank you both.
you.